So, who am I? I'm Artistic Director of a charity based in Portsmouth called Flow Observatorium, which is a equality and diversity organisation arguing for parity and equity for not only autistic people but all neurodivergent people. I also work as a mental health champion for Nottingham University. They have a project there called Mental Health Autism. Their specialism subject is suicide in autism, but as most autistic people I've met tend to suffer from mental health issues, this is a really important and quite distinctly different way of looking at autism research, actually doing something for autistic people. Oh, I must warn you, my talk may contain irony, it may contain humour, it would definitely contain metaphor and sarcasm, just so we're clear there. So I'm an artist, whatever that may mean. You can read whatever you like into it, and this talk I will show you a little bit about what I do, a little bit about autistic culture, and a fair bit about how to support autistic people. But primarily, as well as all these other things, I'm an autistic person. So who am I? I am autistic and I'm human. You know, that's kind of surprising for some people. It takes, they don't mind the autistic bit, but they find the human bit a bit difficult. I told you it would contain humour and irony. I feel I have skills, not deficits, most of the time, unless I'm made to feel that I have deficits, not skills. And unfortunately, that's one of the things we run up against. And these skills have been perfect for both my careers as an artist and a paleontologist. So I've never trained as an artist. I trained as a geologist, paleontologist, stratigrapher. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So I was a late diagnosis. I don't really like the term diagnosis, but it's what everybody uses, so there we go. So I wasn't identified as being autistic till 2013. That may seem a long time. I was identified as being dyslexic in 1999, primarily because my son was identified as being dyslexic, and they told me, had you thought you were dyslexic? And I said, yeah, I was rubbish. I was always told I was rubbish at school. Now, that was a complete lack of understanding of what being dyslexic was on my behalf. But over the next 6 months, I found out what being dyslexic was, and I started writing. So my being identified as being autistic was 2013. I was probably one of the last people in the country in late April to get a diagnosis of Asperger's, because then the DSM changed at the beginning of May. But I really don't take much note. You know, if anybody says, you know, are you autistic? I say yes, because I prefer to use autistic rather than Asperger's, because Asperger's tends to have other connotations. So this is me when I was about 7 or 8. I was kind of happy then. This is a piece of artwork I did in the mid-2000s. 2 little boys, there's a bit of a pun there. Both refer to events that changed people's lives forever, because at school my life was a very unhappy one, because I went to school when dinosaurs ruled the earth, hence my interest in geology. And one teacher in particular decided in my 4th year at junior school, when I was 10, to bully me mercilessly. He bullied everyone mercilessly, but those of us who showed a little bit of weakness, he used his knife to go in there. So things happened to me when I was 10 that changed my life forever. So this is how I feel about reading and writing. It's not because I don't love language. I love language. I love the meaning of words. Words are important. Words start wars. Words end wars. But that's how I feel. And this was a piece of artwork I did in about 2007. And that is my school pen from school. I have 2 of them. And I kept them. I keep a lot of things. But that's the pen I was writing with when I was 13, 14. But age 10, the headmaster came round the room with his cane behind his back, and he said, and he looked at my picture that I was drawing, because I communicated mostly in pictures, And he said, "I'd like to see that on the wall, please." And my teacher decided to spoil it, and he asked me to write my name on the back. Now, my name's Jonathan, not John, and there's 7 or 8 different ways of spelling it before you get involved with tricky H's. So I shortened it to John. Now, I spelt my name wrong, and the teacher held the picture up in front of the class and tore it up and said, "You will never be anyone." So I decided not to go to art college. So I went and did my other love, and my other love is my curiosity of what's up there, what's down there, and what's around me. This really only came out in sort of 2008, 2009, when I made a lot of artwork that expressed how I'd been brought up. And this was one of the things I did. I had a Paul Hamlin book of the star systems when I was at school, probably at the same time that I was being harmed, and looking at nature kept me sane, mostly. So I referenced this by making a lot of fake star maps, and I made all these from the patterns of chewing gum on Brighton Station. As you do. I actually asked for permission to take photographs, and they said no, so I did it anyway. And I named them. This is called the Uncanny Lemur, and I named them at random from doing Wikipedia searches. You can click on a thing and say, just take me to a random page. Now, unfortunately, I have PTSD, and this is how it feels. A lot of autistic people have PTSD. I wonder why. We'll come on to that in a bit later. But sometimes the world just wants, I just feel like the world just wants me to take my skin off, walk into a place and change into someone else. And I made this particular piece of artwork before I knew I was autistic. And it was done for a gallery in Kent. So that literally is not my skin, but a layer of paper that's been peeled off. I can draw. I drew from a very early age. This is a picture, a portrait of Claire Goose. I stopped after I drew the eyes, just because I felt it was complete at that point. This is one of the pictures that I drew after finding out I was dyslexic. Now, when I left school, I went to university, studied to be a geologist. I didn't want to work on an oil rig, I wanted to work in a museum. So I took a year out before my PhD in sharks, as you do. And I worked at the Barbican Art Gallery. And it was there with the pictures on the wall that I could taste and touch that I decided, I remembered when I was 6, I said I was going to be an artist. Didn't know why, I just said I was. So I gave up the idea of going to Canada and studying sharks, and I started drawing for books. And as a geologist, I had a niche market because I could illustrate. I was a geologist, so I went to people like Shell who said, "Can you draw this?" And I said, "Yes, I can." Then they didn't have to get a geologist to explain to me what I needed to draw. So when I found out I was dyslexic, this was a competition, and it was called a letter of the alphabet. Yes, I do take things literally. I wonder why. But I also was a book illustrator, and eventually I got a name for doing really complicated diagrams and drawings. Yes, the devil is in the detail. And this was one of them. It was for an unpublished book, unfortunately, but I specialised in geology and history. They could show me a plan, and I would create the building out of the plan from lots of different reference. But I also do this too. So this is a digital illustration that I made at Turner Contemporary in Margate from the view outside their window. You know, art can be anything. And when I said that being autistic gave me skills, it does give me skills, especially in the creative. It makes me see the world in a very different way. So I transitioned from doing book illustration to doing contemporary artwork probably about 2005-06. Yes, I'd started writing poetry, and I won an international poet place in a book and an international competition in 2001 because I decided to do something very different. Normally I would draw the pictures to other people's words, but this time I decided to let someone else draw the pictures to my words. And I entered the competition and I won a place. I always felt that I didn't have permission to write, but now I do. And I actually met the poet laureate, who was one of the judges, who took me to one side and said, never stop writing. I have at times, but that's been more to do with my mental health than anything. But I started doing contemporary artwork 2006. This was one of the first ones. It's a bit of an expression about how I feel about being dyslexic. So it's a chained library like the one in Hereford, etc. You know, language is the exclusivity of people who can be in charge. And so they're all bolted together, and the spanner's a bit of it doesn't work. The second piece I made was this. It's a map of Cornwall using granite from the different places. It's a geological map of Cornwall, and all the distances and names are written in Braille, so I wanted people to touch it. I've always been a bit of an anarchist when it comes to artwork, so I wanted people to touch this. It got shown at 4 places in 2007. One of them, they hung it upside down, which I really liked. I was also artist in resident with the rail company, hence the Brighton bit. And when I got the Arts Award to do it, I said I would put words in the timetable. When I spoke to the rail company, they said, no way. So there's always a way, so I chatted to the guy who was leaving, who did the timetable artwork, and he said, where do you want it? And I said, I want the word dream in the margin, because I've always dreamt of being an artist and I've always been marginalised. 106,000 they printed, and they got complaints. They said it looked like a spelling mistake. Now, when I proposed doing the residency with the rail company, yes, we were putting things on walls and doing artwork. There's one left, it's at Chichester Station. I also made maps because I decided the hardest thing for me to do was to sit on a train and talk to people. But I like translating things into artwork, so I turned their journeys into maps. This one was a day that I was actually quiet and mute, so I looked out the window and I mapped all the different carrier bags in the trees, in the days when you got carrier bags in the trees. But not only that, but I systemised them into the shop, the condition, the colour. And this actually helped me get my Asperger's diagnosis, although I didn't. Yeah. The rail company didn't like it and said it would encourage littering. But Arts Council and Pallant House did instead, and I got a show out at Pallant House on the back of this, because I'm actually an outsider artist, because I never trained. I like circles. I have synesthesia. I'm a synesthete, and circles are very important to me. And this was a show that I did in 2008-9, which was about the things that, you know, moments in your life that you can never go back to. And this was an exhibition called In the Arms of My Loving Father, because my dad told me one day that he heard the announcement of the atomic bomb dropping and realised that we'd always live under the shadow of it. Not bad for someone who was 14, but who, you know, yes. So people don't like crossing circles, so I set this as a bit of a trickery in the exhibition, where you had a stone circle and people had to go into the centre there and ring the bell. And the bell was exactly the same size as the core of the atomic bomb. No one did. No one would do it, except for one Chinese guy who walked in, went straight over, rang it and left. Must be a cultural thing. People don't like crossing circles. People don't like crossing boundaries unless they're personal ones. And unfortunately, a lot of autistic people end up in trouble because people cross our boundaries. So the first proper contemporary show I did was at Pallant House, and I left some bits there, as I do, because I'm a bit subversive, so I left a cut book and some stones. They found out who it was. They asked me if I had this room, what would I do with it? I said I'd do a geological reinterpretation of my life. So that's what they asked me to do, and I did. So the whole room was filled with different fossils from different times of my life, and I even did diagrams for them. So if you think about it, all geology is a pile of diaries written, you know, on top of each other. And if you understand that layering, then you can translate. So there I am as an autistic person using metaphor. Shoot me. We can, and let's break that myth for a start. Some of us use metaphor, not the metaphors that we make our own metaphors up to. but we can talk in metaphors, we can make in metaphors, we can use them. It's just some people tend to use very obscure ones wrongly. So that show was seen, and someone came out of it and said, would you be willing to do this sort of thing for the Cultural Olympiad? Translating, a modern thing into geology. So that's exactly what I did. So I did a project called Lookabout, which lasted for 3 years during the Cultural Olympiad and a couple of years after, where I turned 2 million minutes of my life. I wrote everything down. This also got my autism diagnosis. And I turned it into a geological metaphor to make a map. So I also collected things. One of the exhibitions I did was in 2012 while the Paralympics was on, and I had boxes of fake fossils within the Natural History Museum, which was great. So all of this ended up as a geological map of my time for the Olympics. Now, not only that, but I like working with people, so let's scrap another myth that autistic people cannot collaborate or don't like socially engaged work. At one of the meetings where I was talking about this, 2 things happened, 2 different streams, 2 different threads you'll need to follow. One was being asked to talk at Cheltenham Science Festival, because by this time people were saying, don't you think you're autistic, John? Yeah. And the other one was someone at a meeting in Southampton at Turner Sims said, what do I do with the Olympics? It's all up in London, it's nothing to do with me. So I thought of an idea, and that was to make paper flags anywhere in the country. And you could do this, it's taking books apart, so there's the subversive bit. So people could make this piece of artwork anywhere they wanted. But the artwork wasn't the flags, the artwork was the conversations you had while making them. So this is Queen Elizabeth Park, the Olympic Park. This is the year after the Olympics where we did that. But we did the flags all around the country. There were artists in residence in different places. And the schools in Hampshire that did this in late 2011, early 2012, made nearly 50,000 of them. And we planted 6,000 at Fratton Park for the torch relay. Now I make artwork from different things. So I worked in with the Institute of Cosmology and Gravitation, and I made sound artwork because of my synesthesia from Supernova. And that got played in London. One day in the Tate, in the Turbine, we were invited to come and play for the day in the Turbine Hall. As long as it didn't mark or do any damage, we could do whatever we wanted. So every time I've been in the Turbine Hall, I hear seagulls, because that's what my synesthesia does. So I decided to play the sound of seagulls for the day. Oh, how did you think of that, John? Yeah. So and I also put a piece of yellow tape on the floor, which is very faint in that picture, because I hate yellow. I can't touch yellow. Yellow tastes of mould. I have colour synesthesia to taste, so I've never really painted. All the illustration work I did in pure layers of colour, because colour confuses me. So I stuck that on the floor, played the sound of seagulls, and at the end of the time it came to take it up, and unfortunately the tape cleaned the floor. So technically I didn't mark it, but I did go back and confess 10 years later. In 2010, when they did this 10 years opening thing, they had a confessions booth, so I went and confessed to 2 things: that I'd started to fill the crack up with Scrabble letters. Yes. And that I'd marked the floor, but they've repolished it since. So. And the other stream I spoke to you about was, I got asked to speak at Cheltenham Science Festival, and this is when I was starting to think that I might be autistic, because I put 2 and 2 together and came up with 19. And they said, you'll be speaking with a man called Simon Baron-Cohen and another artist called Ben and Gabriel. Gabriel's since passed on, and I still work with Ben. But bizarrely, both Simon, who I'd never met before, and I gave almost identical talks on autistic creativity. He actually had someone else who was writing everything down that he knew about the weather. So after the talk we did and the question and answer, and I'll let people have question and answer after this. Wellcome Trust said you two should work together, so we put in an application and I became artist in resident at the Autism Research Centre in Cambridge for a year. And Simon had said to me, if you could think of a metaphor for autistic people can not only see the detail but the wood and all the trees as well. So I did, and we came up with making one of these, which is a modular synthesizer. You have to know what each bit does, but you won't get a sound out of it unless you wire it up. And you have to know globally how to wire it up. But I also made music out of MRI machines, and we played both at an event in London. But the biggest thing was I documented the whole thing in poetry, which you can find online. Now, I'm going to throw this one in very quickly just to break this up. So in 2013, as I've explained, I got my diagnosis of being autistic. So I'd like you to think, how much post-diagnosis support do you think I've had from official sources? None, some, lots and lots. Yeah, A, absolutely nothing. So 2013 was my DX. How much post-DX support do you think I've had from autistic people? Lots and lots. This was my DX in 2013. How much do you think mental health support differed pre and post-diagnosis? Lots and lots. I had PTSD in 2011. I was treated, fine, sorted. I had PTSD again afterwards. It's not been sorted since. People blame being autistic. So the piece I wrote, the poetry I wrote, I was asked to work. I got seen, I got headhunted, and I worked with Peter Brook on Valley of Astonishment, which was a play about synesthesia and memory. And he said, you need to write your own plays and perform them, so I did. And Games with the Warthorse talks about how I acquired PTSD. And I wrote that for Venice Biennale in 2015. I like seeing things that aren't there. I like digital, so I make lots of digital artwork. And there'll be one in the session in a little bit. So I've been chosen to do some projects because I'm autistic. So now we're talking about 2014. 2014 was the year I got PTSD again, but 2014 was also the year I was commissioned to do this. Democracy Street was the Magna Carta 800s digital and social inclusion project. So anybody around the country could join in, and you had an app on your phone and you could hit it and it would tell you what roads around about were named after people who might have made a difference. I mean, the political situation has changed in 4 years, but this was to encourage people to use their vote. But the subversive message underneath this, and it was a non-sectarian project commissioned by Parliament, by the Speaker himself. So the underlying message was to compare some of our modern politicians with, let's say, statesmen of the past. So what happened was you tapped on your phone, you got a screen up like this, and if you were in King John Street, it told you what King John did. So King John obviously connected with Magna Carta. And then what I wanted people to do was look into their family history, know where they lived, a bit of social cohesion. Then they could make artwork. They could write poetry, music, whatever about the roads they were in. But I was more interested in the people who were not famous, for the roads named after people who had done something, because one person can make a difference. I actually did my family history because of this project, and it turns out I'm actually a direct descendant of King John, which is really ironic, and several Magna Carta barons, which is really ironic. So this is some of the artwork I made from Wollstonecraft Street in Bournemouth. There was only one Wollstonecraft Street, Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the very first suffragettes. There was one street when I started the project, there were two, because there was another named after her in London near King's Cross. So the artwork ended up like this. So we'd make posters of the artwork. So there's Cecil Road. And, yep, there is a Guy Fawkes Street. There's one, it's in Manchester. And he was the last honest man to enter Parliament. But then there were some that I chose, and I chose Wilfred Owen Drive. Because of his First World War experience, and due to the project I found out all my family's First World War experience too, and there's De Montfort Street as well. Now, I'm also responsible for this. This is called Cat Researchers. William, 47, is researching autistic mice. Here he is having a break with his favourite mouse model. He calls his mouse friend autistic, but uses people with autism in his academic papers. His mouse friend keeps silent, even though he prefers mouse with autism. Yeah. So, as autistic people, we can't inherit a fixed, unmoving view of life and art from the past generation. Autistic people are now defining their own narrative. It's not fixed. It's being made by us right now. And to break and be able to grow together again in a better way, that's the difficult art. These two quotes are from my favourite artist of mine called Asger Jorn. So, definitions. Do autistic people have their own identity and culture? And if they do they own it? Here's a couple of definitions of culture. Characteristic features of everyday existence, such as diversions or a way of life shared by people in a place or time. Another version of culture. And what I'll do with the word slides is I'll make a PDF that can be got from David. So another version of culture, the set of values, conventions and social practices associated with a particular field. In this case, maybe goth culture. Culture, the set of shared attitudes, values, goals and practices that characterise an institution or organisation, i.e. corporate culture. Autistic people have a culture. Identity. Identity is the qualities, belief, personality, looks and expressions that make a personality or group. So, we have shared characteristics. We have shared language. We have shared knowledge. We have shared patterns of behaviour. We have shared social constructs. We have a shared identity. We have shared habits and shared creativity as autistic people. Because shared characteristics create a unique narrative, informed, owned and shared by the particular group of people who created it, and so it retains an innate implied authenticity. Sometimes our culture is appropriated and stolen from us. Unfortunately, autism culture is not autistic-led. Autistic people seem replaced and excluded from evolving this narrative. But autistic culture is autistic-led. It involves autistic people informing, evolving and owning their narrative, mostly. And neurodiversity isn't a political stance or a movement, it's a living fact. A friend of mine, Steve Silberman, if you haven't read it, read Neurotribes. And neurodiversity is all of us. There's sometimes a little bit of language misunderstanding here. I'm not a neurodiverse person. I'm a neurodivergent person. And I'm not a neurodiverse person in the same way a cat isn't biodiverse. A cat is part of biodiversity. And if you forever look at a cat as being a failed to evolve dog, you'll never see the beauty in the cat or the dog. So neurodiversity is all of us in the same way that biodiversity is the variety and variability of life on this planet. So the diversity of culture within society should be decided by the many, not the few, and should be for the many, not the few. Unfortunately, autistic culture is trying to be appropriated. We're told what we can and can't do when it shouldn't be like that. You wouldn't tell that to LGBTQ or BAME. So why is autism free reign? An open house for anyone to fiddle with. So when accepted and enabled, autistic people are able to not only play an equal role in society, but often an extraordinary and necessary one. I'm not for going back in time and re-evaluating people, but I suspect some of the people in the turning point of our history have been neurodivergent, and without free and new thinkers, society would not exist. So if you want to see work that's different, commission people who view the world differently. But you then have to think differently about how you work with them. Unfortunately, some people in the arts don't understand this. So this is from a series of images called Monument to the Invisible Autistic Person, because often that's exactly how we are, whether that's from our choice or from other people's. Can anybody remember the song that this came from? Answers on a postcards afterwards. But identity is the crisis, can't you see? Because people don't want autistic people to have an identity, whether that's because of a financial or an ideological self-interest in autistic people not speaking for themselves. So, challenges to our identity. Is an identity positive or negative? Is it imposed or self-identified? There's a lot of talk within the autistic community about the validity of self-diagnosis. Well, I self-diagnosed before I got my proper, if you want to call it that, diagnosis. And for some people, they're not able to obtain a piece of paper that says you're autistic on it. So, very quickly, challenges to our identity. Systemic attitudes to autistic people can't change unless autistic people are recognised as a part of the system, not apart from the system. Challenges to identity, from the system to autistic people, to the system from autistic people, because we're starting to challenge back. So here we go, challenges to our identity, from the system to autistic people. It's mainly language and attitudes. Challenges to identity from the system to autistic people. Language engenders attitudes, attitudes engender language. That's how a lot of autistic people judge organisations and other people, seeing how up to date they are on the preferences that autistic people prefer. So here we go. I don't live with autism. I live with my wife and 2 cats. I don't fight with autism. I fight poor attitudes to me. I don't live on the spectrum. I live in a house. So I would say, don't do things for autism. Do things for autistic people. This was one of the fake signs I used to put up on my residency. Challenges to our identity. You know, I don't have mild autism. John, you're not the same as the autistic person we learnt about in our awareness training. You can't have autism. Oh, you mean your awareness training isn't wrong? Mild is best used to describe the weather or curries. This is another one I get. You don't speak for all autistic people. But you see, if I make a comment up here about being an artist, do you imagine that I speak for all artists? So why, if I make a comment about autism, am I told that I'm speaking for all autistic people? See, this is the sort of inconsistency that autistic people are now challenging. This is another one I get. What's your special gift? Can you do a Rubik's Cube in a second? If I drop a box of matches, how many seconds will you count it? You know, but this is my answer. I normally say surviving, because unfortunately a lot of autistic people have to survive, not thrive, because of society's attitudes to us. I used to put these up everywhere when I was dyslexic. So challenges to our identity from outside. Last year there was a hashtag that went around Twitter, and a lot of autistic people live on Twitter and communicate on Twitter, called End Autism Now. An autism-free brain, preventing autism and autism deficits. You know, yes, a lot of this came from the States, you know, and it stems from attitudes and language. You know, I'm not here to be prevented or cured, I'm here to be enabled. So challenges to our identity again, others deciding what in the autistic person's best interest versus understanding what interests autistic people. Don't make decisions for me, ask me. Challenges to our identity, words used by the autism and wider community that degrade or dehumanise us. You're not like my child. We're all a little bit autistic. Well, we're not all a little bit autistic. Autistic people are. And the other one, you're not like my child. I now say you're not like my parents. Being sarcastic again. Shocking. But I've seen where the degradation of humanity goes when one group in society decide another group in society shouldn't exist. And I took this photograph at Dachau. Challenges. My challenges. The biggest challenge I have is, do I belong? And if you don't actively include us, then you're actively excluding us. And excluding people is discrimination. It might sound really strange, but most autism research, most of the autism researchers have never met an autistic person. They meet a lot of mice, who they say are autistic, but I think that's fake news. So challenges, do I belong? They say masking gives you mental health issues, and being made to feel you don't belong pushes you further. A lot of autistic people I meet have mental health issues. A lot of autistic people I meet contemplate leaving early. And if you're made to not feel you belong in a society, well, what's left? 8 times more autistic people take their own lives than anyone else. It's a huge issue that's not spoken about. Most autistic people I meet have PTSD. And there's a paper coming out soon that will show that one of the leading causes of PTSD in autistic people are mental health care professionals. Let that sink in. But we take the blame. It's not up to autistic people to justify we should be included. It's up to others to justify why we're not included. Don't try to make us conform to another's culture's measures, standards, or identity. If you make us try and fit your world, you'll never see ours, and it will damage us. Autistic people need asking what they need, because if you assume or guess, you will damage us. Autistic people need involving on their terms, because if you apply your rules, you will damage us. Autistic people need talking with, not for, because if you don't learn authentically from us, you will damage us. This might sound quite shocking, but a lot of this is not, it's not rocket science, is it? If you wanted to know what it was like to stand on the Himalayas and breathe the air in, you would ask someone who'd actually stood on the Himalayas and breathed the air in. You wouldn't look at the telly and get it from a program, or ask the mountaineer's mother. And by the way, that's the rocket in the rocket science. So my hopes are that organisations will involve autistic people and not just include autistic people, because there's a huge difference between inclusion and involvement. You can include people and leave them out. My hopes are that society will learn to accept and respect the autistic voice, identity and narrative, and that we are experts by experience in being autistic. My hopes are that we autistic people will be given the space to cultivate, grow and nurture our own narrative and identity like other minority groups are. So, we need to create a positive social chain reaction. You can help with this as ambassadors. We need to create a cultural climate change for autistic people. You can help bring this about. I did say that crap was the bar, didn't I? So here we go. So I say pants to awareness. It's understanding and acceptance that are needed. You can be aware of a lion in this room, but if you understood what a lion in this room could do, you wouldn't be in the room with it. There is a huge gulf between understanding and awareness. And what are you aware of? A lot of the awareness that people are putting out was not written or informed by autistic people. And as an autistic advocate and campaigner, sometimes I have to fight more about what people have gone before me and said, oh, John, you can't be autistic, you're nothing like the training I've done. Oh, well, was the training by an autistic person? No. Oh, well, then you haven't done autistic training and understanding, have you? Why is that then? Well, because you had to ask why, that's the reason why. You know, autistic artists are sparks that must glow as brightly as possible, but you mustn't let us burn out. You know, autistic burnout is really common. You know, autistic people have to fight both society, getting a job, conventions, people's attitudes to us, the language they use to us. And, you know, it's especially important in employment because, you know, I know, you know, a little bit about what was told to you this morning. And, you know, we can do jobs, we can do a lot of jobs, but if we're not enabled to do them, and very often it's often blamed on us. You know, I'll take an example from mental health services. Oh, this treatment's not working, John. I think you need to try harder. Maybe the treatment isn't appropriate for me. No, I'm sorry. It's worked on everyone before. You know, autistic blaming is very easy to do, but that takes a toll on our lives. It helps us to feel we don't belong because we feel misunderstood. So these are a few logos. But I'll leave you with this. You know, autism. I'm not the word or the letters or the spaces in between or the person in your imagination you think I should have been. You know, I'm just simply human like the rest of you.